Let's make Africa the tree of life. Let's make Africa the tree of life. Hello, welcome to Josh Bowman. So, in today's episode, we're looking at slavery in Africa. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you are new to the channel. And if you don't know what we do on this channel, we talk about Africa's history. And without my talking, let's start today's episode. So, slavery in Africa is our topic for today, or in this episode. So, slavery in Africa represents a deeply complex and multifaceted historical phenomenon, extending far beyond the transatlantic slave trade. It encompasses diverse indigenous forms of servitude that predated European involvement, as well as external trade across the Sahara and Indian Ocean. This presentation aims to provide a comprehensive analysis of these various manifestations of slavery, their profound and enduring impact on African societies, the process of their abolition, and their continuing influence in the contemporary Africa. By offering an understanding, this presentation seeks to move beyond simplistic narratives, exploring the varied forms, historical evolution, devastating consequences across economic, social, demographic, and political spheres, and the persistent influence of slavery on the continent of Africa today. So let's look at the types of slavery, starting with indigenous form of slavery before pre-colonial or in pre-colonial Africa. Before the Europeans came to Africa, there existed a form of slavery. So let's look at this form of slavery. So slavery in historical Africa was not a monolithic institution. It wasn't more like a chattel form of slavery. So let's look at what it entailed, but rather a spectrum of diverse servitude systems, widely prevalent across the continent in various forms. So these systems were deeply integrated into social and economic fabric of many African communities long before the arrival of the Europeans. So one common form was debt slavery, also known as township, where individuals or their relatives, often children, were used as collateral to secure repayment of debt. The labor performed by the debtor or a family member would serve to repay the loan, though it was often difficult to escape indebtedness due to accruing costs and high interest rates. This practice was particularly common throughout West Africa among the groups such as the Akan, the Ewe, the Gan, the Yoruba, and Ido people. So township was often distinct from chattel slavery, as kinship ties could provide a degree of protection. An arrangement might include specific limited terms of services. So the enslavement of war captive was another widespread and significant source of enslaved people in pre-colonial Africa. So when diverse African empire, nations, kinship groups engage in conflict, individuals from the defeated side were regularly enslaved, viewed as outsiders. This mechanism for generating enslaved individuals was deeply embedded in many African societies, providing a pre-existing system that would later be exploited by external slave traders. So military slavery, which is also another form of slavery that existed in pre-colonial Africa. So military slavery involved the acquisition and training of conscripted military units who retained the identity of military slave even after their service. These groups were often managed by a patron, such as a government head or an independent warlord, who would deploy troops for political interest and financial gains. Slavery also existed for domestic and court purposes. A widespread practice across Africa where enslaved individuals worked primarily within the master's household. These domestic slaves were often treated with more leniency, considered part of the master's household, and generally not sold to others without extreme costs. So they could, in many cases, own their profit from their labor, marry, and pass land on to their children. Other forms of slavery also included prostitution and enslavement of criminals, practiced in various parts of the continent. Slave for sacrifice were also a grim reality in some regions, with notorious examples such as the annual custom of Dahomey, where hundreds of prisoners might be sacrificed. Plantation slavery also occurred primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. A critical understanding of pre-colonial Africa servitude reveals that it was not a monolithic institution, unlike the transatlantic slave trade, but rather a spectrum of social statuses with varying degree of right and integration. This challenges the common misconception that often conflate all African forms with the absolute property status characteristic of the transatlantic slave trade. So all this means is the form of slavery that existed in pre-colonial Africa was varied. And even though it was also a form of servitude, but it was a bit lenient compared to that of the transatlantic slave trade. So for instance, the ability of domestic slaves to own property or to be integrated into kinship groups highlights a significant difference in social standings compared to the dehumanizing chattel principle. While stigma often remain, the flexibility and potential for upward mobility within this system underscore their distinct nature. The economic and social drivers of indigenous servitude also present a unique context. So in many African communities where land could not be owned, the enslavement of individuals served as a primary means to increase a person's influence and expand connection. That's very interesting. This suggests that in societies where land was abundant or communally held, human labor and social networks derived from controlling people through kinship or servitude became the primary form of wealth and power accumulation, rather than territorial expansion or land ownership. So this fundamental difference in economic value compared to land-based economies shaped the role of slavery in these regions. So Ibn Battuta, upon visiting the ancient kingdom of Mali in the mid-14th century, observed that local inhabitants compete in number of slaves and servants they possessed. Such an interesting phenomenon, anyway. And he himself received a slave boy as a hospitality gift. While many forms of servitude were flexible, chattel slavery, where the enslaved person is treated as absolute property of the owner, was also present. So in spite of the leniency of all the forms of trade that have been discussed so far, there was also the chattel slavery, which existed in pre-colonial Africa. So the owner was free to sell, trade, or treat the enslaved person as any other piece of property. And the children of the enslaved were often retained as the master's property. Evidence of long histories of chattel slavery exists in the Nile River Valley, much of the Sahel, and North Africa, including under ancient Carthage, the Roman Empire, and the Eastern Romans. So early European reports from 1600s, however, often conflated various forms of servitude with chattel slavery, which some scholars have called unreliable. noting that the best evidence of widespread chattel's form of slavery comes from major kingdoms, particularly along the coast, rather than stateless societies. So let's look at the major external trade originating from Africa. So looking at the indigenous pre-colonial trade, now let's look at the major external trade originating from Africa. So beyond the indigenous form of servitude, Africa became a central node in several major external slave trades, each with distinct characteristics, roots, and profound consequences. These trades were deeply interconnected with global economic shifts and involved significant African participation, both as victim and as active, albeit often coerced partners in supply chain. So let's look at these external trade that originated from the African continent. So one, we have the trans-Saharan trade. So the trans-Saharan trade, also known as the Arab slave trade, was a historical network that primarily transported enslaved individuals across the Saharan desert, from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, where they were sold to the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. Established in antiquity, this trade continued throughout the Middle Ages, driven by a constant demand for enslaved labor in Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. Following the 8th century conquest of North Africa, Arab Berbers and other ethnic groups ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, utilizing routes along the Nile towards Nubia and across the Sahara towards West Africa. Key routes included the Dab al Abain, Dab el Abain Trail from Darfur to Egypt, and the Gadames route connecting the Niger River bent to Gadames and Tripoli, and the Taghaza Trail from the Mali Empire to Morocco. Estimates suggest that between 6 and 10 million black enslaved individuals were moved from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world, with approximately 7.2 million crossing the Sahara from the mid-7th century until the 20th century. Enslavement was achieved through violent raiding, capture, and dangerous forced march across the desert, with enslaved people treated as chattels in North African markets such as Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Cairo. Enslaved individuals were also acquired by purchasing them from local black rulers, many of whom became middlemen in the trafficking, rounding up members of nearby villages to sell to visiting merchants. The 12th century Arab geographer Al-Idrisi noted instances where Muslim merchants would steal the children of the Zang using beads, luring them away before capture. So those of us who don't know or who are yet to know date is a form of fruit. The trans-Saharan slave trade had significant impact on West and North African societies. Economically, so let's look at some of these impacts. And one, we'll start with the economical impact. So economically, it created new source of wealth and power for West African states and rulers who controlled the trade routes, such as Kanem Bonu Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire, enabling them to consolidate power and expand territories. So this commerce also facilitated the exchange of goods like gold, salt, and ivory. Socially and culturally, it contributed to the spread of Islam and Arabic literacy, fostering culture exchange between Africa and the Mediterranean world. So this is the economical, social, and cultural impact. Let's look at the political impact. So politically, however, it destabilized many West African societies by increasing warfare and rage as states sought to capture more enslaved people, disrupting traditional social and economic systems. Demographically, it led to the loss of millions of people, particularly young men and women, affecting West Africa's population, gender ratio, and agricultural production. The trade gradually declined with the arrival of the Europeans on the West African coast in the 15th century, as the Atlantic slave trade offered a more efficient means of transporting large number of enslaved people by ship. So don't forget, these are trade that were originating from the African continent before colonialism or before the arrival of the Europeans. So let's now go to one of the slave trade that were originated from the African continent. And this time around, we have the Indian Ocean slave trade. So Eastern Africa served as a source of enslaved laborers for Indian Ocean market for nearly 2 millennia. That was a long time. So early accounts such as the first century CE Periplus of the Eritrean Sea advised on slave trading opportunities, particularly for beautiful girls and concubinage. After the first century, the export of black Africans from Tanzania, Mozambique, and other Bantu groups became a constant factor. Muslim, Arabs, and Swahili traders gained control of the Swahili coast and the sea route during the 9th century, capturing the Bantu people from the interior and transporting them to the coast. The trade route extended along the coast, including the Swahili coast and the Horn of Africa, and inland via three main caravan routes that connected the coast to the far interior. These routes reached regions as far as Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, which is now Lake Tanzania. That was the name Tanzania held in those days. The Eastern Congo and South Central Africa. Estimates for the total number of people transported from the 7th century until 1920 range around 8 million, averaging 5,700 per year. That was a lot of people Africa was losing. Though other estimates suggest over 300,000 exported from the east coast, with about two-thirds remaining within Africa. So the Indian Ocean slave trade relied heavily on violence as labor demand increased, with groups like the Ngoni raiders and the Inyamwezi Ruga actively involved in collecting captives. Demand accelerated with the advent of higher capacity ships and growing need for labor on plantations in the region, leading to tens of thousands of captives being taken annually. The economic impact of the East African societies was significant. Rising demand for industrializing Western economies for tropical products such as cloves and coconut stimulated the trade, leading to the emergence of substantial markets on the coast and islands like Zanzibar and Pemba for plantation labor and grain production. Socially and culturally, enslaved individuals often assimilated into rural areas. Islamic law, prevalent in many destination societies, granted certain rights to enslaved people, including the right to marry and limited property rights, often leading to high rates of manumission. The offspring of a master and a slave concubine were considered free and legitimate, which contributed to the formation of more stable communities and a gradual darkening of slave-owning families over time. Politically, militarized communities played a significant role in capturing capturing and accumulating enslaved people. The legal trade to Zanzibar and Pemba was eventually closed by treaties with the British in 1873 and 1876. So let's look at another form of slavery originating from the African continent. And this time around, we have the infamous transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade, uh, beginning in the 1400s, involved European powers like Portugal, Spain, France, and England, exploiting newly discovered lands in the Americas. This is where it started. Initially, Europeans sought to enslave indigenous people for labor, but their population rapidly declined due to diseases, famine, and conflict. So before the Europeans ventured into Africa, they had tried North America or South America or the Americas. Driven by the desire for wealth and immense demand for labor, intense production of commodities like sugarcane on plantations, European powers shifted their focus to trafficking human beings from Africa. Europeans assessed and greatly expanded upon pre-existing systems of slave trading in Africa, transforming localized practice into unprecedented global enterprise. Between 1500 and 1867, nearly 3 million Africans were kidnapped, forced onto European and American ships, and trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean. Approximately 12 million Africans were enslaved in total during this period. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing ordeal lasting 1 or 2 months. Conditions on board slaves. So conditions on board slave ships were appalling. Huge number of people were crammed into very small spaces. Men, women, and children were separated, and families were torn apart. Overcrowding, poor diet, dehydration, and disease led to exceptionally high death rate. For instance, 450,000 out of the 3.4 million Africans transported by the British or the British ships died during the Atlantic crossing. Resistance, whether through refusing food and water or organized rebellion, was met with savage punishment. Captives were moved from nearly all regions of the African interior to the coast market, then transported across the Atlantic to 179 identified ports in the Americas, with 20 ports alone receiving over 8 million Africans. Major destinations included Brazil, or Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Salvador de Bahia, also in Brazil, Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Dominic, and Charleston, South Carolina. The European demand for slave labor was so immense that traders and their agents set far inland, devastating regions of Africa. Powerful African leaders and merchants willingly exchanged enslaved Africans for European goods such as alcohol, beads, and clothes. Groups like the Imbamgala and of Angola and Nyamwezi of Tanzania serve as intermediaries. That's quite a sad phenomenon. Anyway, waging war on African states to capture people for export. The most common source of enslaved people for this trade was taking uh, war captives by enemy tribe or state. A pre-exist or this practice existed way before the Europeans joined this trade. Let's put it in that way. So a critical observation is that uh, is the profound difference in characteristics and impact across these major slave trade. While all involved immense suffering, the Indian trade, for example, often saw enslaved Africans assimilated into rural areas, with Islamic law granting some rights and higher rates of manumission. This contrasts sharply with the transatlantic slave trade, which defined enslaved people as chattels, otherwise personal properties with virtually no rights, and subjected them to brutal plantation labor with extreme high mortality rates, meaning the slaves were dying and dying and dying and dying. So surviving was by the fittest. This distinction illustrates how the type of external trade significantly influenced the consequences for the enslaved societies. Enslaved and the external trade significantly influenced the consequences of the enslaved and societies they left behind, leading to wide historical and cultural legacies. The role of European technology and demand in escalating enslavement is also undeniable. While indigenous slavery existed, European involvement transformed it from a localized, often kinship-based system into an industrial scale. Dehumanizing enterprise, European ships enabled the transport of millions of people over such a great distance at a scale without, without precedent in human history. This insatiable demand for plantation labor in the Americas drove the slave trade or the search for slaves far inland, the devastating region, dramatically increasing the scale and brutality beyond anything seen in pre-existing African system. So the transatlantic slave trade was really brutal to Africans or the enslaved Africans. The various slave trade had profound and enduring consequences that reshaped the economic, social, demographic, and political fabric of African societies, with many of these impacts continuing to be felt in contemporary Africa. So let's look at the economic consequences of the transatlantic slave trade. So the trade resulted in severe depletion of human capital, robbing African countries of their most vital labor force, specifically men and women in their prime and productive age, typically between 16 and 35 years. This loss was catastrophic, as these individuals were crucial for developing farmland and societies across the continent. The absence of this strong and energetic workforce significantly hampered economic activity and is directly attributed to the persistent poverty experienced in Africa today. How true that is, the reality is evident for everyone to see. Anyway, let's continue. Research by scholars like Nathan Nunn indicates a robust negative relationship between the number of enslaved people exported from a country and its subsequent economic performance. Estimates suggest that if the slave trade had not occurred, 72% of the average income gap between Africa and the rest of the world would not have existed. So that 72% average income gap wouldn't have existed if not for the slave trade, implying that Africa could be economically on par with Asia or Latin America today. While the slave trade did not create new source of wealth and power for some African states and rulers who control the trade routes, it fundamentally disrupted traditional economies and trade patterns. The focus shifted from internal development to supplying external demands for human beings. Further, the very nature of slavery fostered corruption involving theft, bribery, and exercise of brute force. and is considered a pre-colonial origin for modern Africa or modern corruption in Africa. A critical observation here is the development trap created by the slave trade. So the pervasive insecurity, violence, and warfare directly contributed to the deterioration of domestic legal institutions and weakening of states. This environment of instability made societies less capable of collective action and long-term development. The need for weapons to defend against raids, which could be obtained by selling enslaved people, further perpetuated the cycle of violence and insecurity, making communities more vulnerable to continued exploitation and hindering their ability to build robust economic foundations. These feedback loops explain the persistence of underdevelopment and ethnic fractionalization in many African regions today. So let's look at the social and then demographic consequences of the transatlantic slave trade. So the trade had a profound demographic impact, resulting in a significant population decline. Researchers estimate that there would have been 112 million more Africans if the slave trade had not occurred. Africa's share of the global population plummeted from 13% in 1750 to 8% in 1900, only returning to 13% by 2014, some 250 years later. The removal of a youthful fertile population depressed future population growth and severely affected processes like marriage and reproduction, a phenomenon still experienced in modern Africa. Beyond the direct loss of life and human capital, the slave trade also led to the introduction and spread of diseases. European slave merchants introduced venereal diseases such as syphilis and smallpox, causing significant population loss, particularly among those in their prime productive years, such as Mpongwe people of Gabon. The pervasive insecurity, violence, and warfare caused by the slave raiding had detrimental impact on social development, leading to a weakening of social cohesion and an erosion of trust. Historical accounts indicate that individuals frequently turn on one another, kidnapping, trafficking, and selling even friends and families into slavery. This created a culture of distrust that persists over generations, with studies documenting a strong negative relationship between the intensity of historical slave trade and contemporary trust levels. This deep-seated suspicion continues to impede social cohesion and collective action today. One of the most pronounced impacts on contemporary Africa is the persistence of racism and skewed value judgment based on color, which continue to create class, social status, and respect hierarchies. The superiority complex exhibited by white people towards black people today, stemming from historical perceptions of color class, and has has influenced extreme decision by black people. So the superiority exhibited by the colonial master to the African or to the black African have led to an impact such as black people using skin lightening and cosmetic surgery just to look white in order to be respected. Anyway, so this represents an incalculable loss, uh, or it represents an internalized loss of culture or an internalized impact on the culture of the African. So the demographic catastrophe represents an incalculable loss of human potential and the sheer scale of population loss, especially of young fertile individuals, uh, meant the loss of generations of potential innovators, workers, parents, and community builders. So some of these young and fertile individuals were transported, could have become parents, innovators, could have developed the continent. Let's continue. So the demographic void created the missing generation, or created the missing generation effect, a missing generation effect, impacting labor supply, innovation, and the very structure of families and communities for centuries, making recovery inherently more difficult and contributing to long-term underdevelopment. So let's look at the political consequences. So the slave trade severely impacted political structures in Africa, causing the deterioration of domestic legal institutions, the weakening of states, and political and social fragmentation. The pervasive insecurity and violence undermine stable government and the ability of states to protect their citizens. The trade also led to increased warfare, raiding, and ethnic fragmentation. It created opportunities for what for those who could mobilize raid and kidnapping, leading to significant political friction and the breaking of political unity. For instance, the slave trade is argued to be partly responsible for the wars that led to the breakup of the Yoruba states. Areas with high slave export intensity tend to exhibit high levels of political fractionalization and a greater proportion of distinct ethnic groups today. The environment of insecurity during the slave trade confined people within ethnic boundaries, impeding the formation of larger communities and broader ethnic identities. Ultimately, slave raiding contributed to the rise of colonialism by weakening the social fabric of the continent and creating vulnerabilities that European powers exploited in the 19th century. The belief among European powers, such as the British, that promoting legitimate trade and European form of government would eradicate slavery inadvertently paved the way for colonial rule. So, in moving from slavery, then we entered into colonial rule. Indeed, the African continent has really suffered and keeps suffering in some way. Anyway, let's continue. So, let's look at the abolition of slavery in Africa. The abolition of slavery in Africa was a protracted and complex process driven by confluence of external pressures, internal resistance, and evolving socio-economic dynamics. So let's look at the external pressures and internal abolitionist movements. The relatively rapid abolition of the transatlantic, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa. So the relatively rapid abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in early 19th century was influenced by a combination of ideological, religious, and economic changes in Europe and the Americas. Ideologically, the Enlightenment, an 18th century intellectual movement, promoted the concept of universal rights, including liberty, which directly contradicted the institution of slavery. Religiously, evangelical groups, notably the Quakers, championed the abolition as an expression of Christian love and moral imperative. Economically, while debated, some argued that slavery was becoming less profitable and increasingly marginal to the livelihoods of the emerging middle class, particularly in Britain. These industrialists and business owners who operated wage-based enterprises perceived slavery as unfairly competing with their interests. That was how profitable slavery became, or the slave trade. Um, they also hoped that ending the slave trade would stabilize and increase profitable trade in African resources and finished goods. So, in abolishing trade, now let's get to their resources further. Anyway, let's continue. Thereby making business in Africa more stable and lucrative. So, further, supporting the abolition could serve to undercut the political power of an older upper class of land owning nobles who derived wealth from slave plantations, creating a complex interplay of humanitarian and pragmatic economic motive. So a timeline of international abolition efforts shows Denmark and Norway banning the African trade in 1803, followed by Britain in 1807 and the United States in 1808. Other European nations like Sweden also in 1813 and the Netherlands in 1814 also terminated their participation. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 formally proclaimed that the slave trade should be abolished as soon as possible. The national cooperation became essential for enforcement, leading to multiple national anti-slavery uh, treaties that established common standards and joint communities and joint commitments for naval patrols. The British Royal Navy or the British Royal Navy's anti-slavery squadron, established in 1808, played a significant role patrolling African waters and seizing 15,000 ships, liberating 150,000 Africans or slaved Africans between 1820 and 1870. Despite these efforts, enforcement faced considerable challenges. Illegal trading continued for decades, especially to sugarcane plantations in Cuba and Brazil, where slaves were still in demand, or there was still high demand for slaves. Further, some African polities with long histories of slave trading were unwilling to halt the supply of captives to the coast or expel foreign dealers. Well, so upon looking at some of these resistance movements, let's look at the resistance of some of the Africans. Don't forget, it wasn't all the Africans who were contributing to the slave trade. So let's look at those who were not contributing to the slave trade. So African resistance and internal abolitionist efforts. African resistance was a crucial, often underestimated factor in the struggle to end slavery. This resistance took various forms, from overt revolt to subtle acts of defiance. The Saint Dominic, or now Haiti, uprising in 1791, led by enslaved people, stand as a pivotal event that contributed to the abolishment of slave trade. Large-scale organized uprisings were a common reaction to the cruelties of slave systems on plantations. Beyond open rebellion, enslaved people fought to retain their families, cultures, and dignity through individual and collective acts of resistance. This included breaking tools, damaging crops, feigning injury or illness to frustrate plantation owners. That was escaping and forming independent, self-sufficient maroon communities. Crucially, some independent African polities also initiated abolition efforts before colonial occupation, demonstrating complex local jurisdiction and normative cultures that influenced their approaches to ending slavery. For example, Ahmed Ahmad Ahmad Bey in the Regency of Tunis passed the first abolition decree in Islamic Africa in 1846. The sultans of Zanzibar also issued anti-slave trade edicts, notably in 1890. As early as 1514, King Alfonso of Congo protested to King of Portugal about illegal enslavement and requested the removal of Portuguese merchants in 1526. Though his efforts were ultimately unsuccessful in stemming the tide of the transatlantic slave trade, at least King Alfonso made an effort and he needs to be commended on that. If all the leaders were to hide the mindset of King Alfonso, I don't think the trade would have extended that far. Anyway, let's continue. So African actors were actively involved as indigenous and activists in the broader global abolitionist movement. Some prominent Euro-American abolitionists self-identified as African and lived in Africa or the diaspora, such as Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Kogwano, who publicly called for the complete abolition of the slave trade and freedom of all enslaved people. Missionaries originating from liberated Africans such as Bombay Africans actively helped fugitive enslaved people and okay, so they helped the fugitive enslaved people to oppose slave owners. Nationalist intellectuals in Ethiopia also called for the expansion of manumission. It is important to note that African rulers often acted not solely out of deference to European anti-slavery agendas or fear of retaliation, but also to protect their countries from the threat of European occupation. Demonstrating a strategic dimension to the abolitionist stance. Anyway, it was all an effort, so we need to be commended. This highlights that African agency was a significant driving force in abolition, often predating influence of European movements, thereby challenging ethnocentric narrative that might otherwise diminish this critical role. So let's look at the enduring legacies and modern slavery in Africa. So the historical slave trade have left indelible mark on the African continent, manifesting in long-term socio-economic and political legacies that continue to shape its development, as well as the persistence of various forms of modern slaves. So long-term socio-economic and political legacies. The regions most intensely affected Okay, so the regions most intensely affected by the slave trade continue to exhibit persistent economic disparities, with lower level of economic development and high poverty rates today. The 72% income gap between Africa and the rest of the world is a stark indicator of this enduring economic disadvantage, suggesting that without the slave trade, Africa's development could have paralleled uh, that of Asia or Latin America. The slave trade also contributed to greater ethnic fractionalization and the deterioration of local ethnic institutions The pervasive insecurity during the slave trade confined people within ethnic boundaries, impeding the formation of a larger community and a broader ethnic identity. This historical fragmentation continues to pose institutional challenges and contributes to political instability in many contemporary African states today. A profound social consequences is the erosion of trust. A strong negative relationship exists between the intensity of historical slave trade and an individual's trust in others today in Africa, suggesting or creating a culture of distrust that persists across generations. This historical context, where individuals frequently betrayed one another by kidnapping and selling, even friends and family members, into slavery fostered a deep-seated suspicion that continued to impede social cohesion and collective action in modern African society. Culturally, the historical racialization of slavery has left a profound impact, manifesting in persistent racism and skewed value judgment based on color, which continue to create class and social status hierarchies. This legacy influenced contemporary perceptions and even practice like skin lightening, or this legacy influences contemporary perceptions and even practice like skin lightening, reflecting the deep internalized culture or cultural impact of dehumanizing historical narrative. Demographically, the void created by the removal of millions of young fertile individuals and the associated reproductive impact depressed population growth and affect marriage, or has affected population growth and has also affected marriage patterns and also introduced foreign diseases to Africa, also continue to be felt in modern Africa. The continent's population trajectory was fundamentally altered for centuries. So Africa has been a prey for a very long, long time. Maybe one day Africa may be liberated. Let's continue the presentation. So, contemporary forms of slavery in Africa today. So, despite former abolition, various forms of modern slavery persist in Africa, often uh, as adaptation or directly, uh, often as adaptation or direct continuation of historical practices, exacerbated or exhibited by the long-term legacies of the past. Modern slavery is an umbrella term encompassing forced labor, human trafficking, and forced marriage. These practices continue in Africa despite being illegal. Chattel slavery still exists in parts of North Africa, notably Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. In these regions, people often from minority ethnic groups are born into slavery and are bought, traded, and sold frequently along racial lines, as seen black Haritin people forced to work for light-skinned white more. And this is occurring in Mauritania. This direct continuation of descent-based slavery illustrates how historical practices have adapted and persisted. Forced labor is the most common form of slavery or modern slavery in Africa, affecting an estimated 2.9% or 2.9 per thousand people in Africa. It is prevalent in sectors such as mining, agriculture, fishing, and domestic work. Job seekers are often misled by traffickers with false promises and then violently coerced into labor without pay. Examples include the conflict system in Togo, where children are forced into domestic servitude, and the Taliban, uh, children in Senegal who are forced to beg. Forced marriages particularly impact women and girls in the region, with 1 in every 300 females affected compared to 1 in every 1,000 males. Reports of child marriages increased significantly after the COVID-19 pandemic in Sudan, Egypt, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Senegal, and Uganda. This practice is also used as a negative coping mechanism by families in conflict zones to protect girls from violence by giving them in marriage at an early age. Anyway, let's continue. Or by fighters who abduct women and girls for domestic and sexual slavery. Other contemporary forms include debt bondage or the poundship, a continuation of historical practice where people are used as collateral for impossible loans, often inherited across generations. Contract enslavement, or yes, contract enslavement involves luring job seekers with false employment promises to remote locations, then violently coercing them into unpaid labor. This is another form, or is part of the forms of slavery occurring in modern Africa. State enslavement or war enslavement refers to the government-sponsored forced labor, including the recruitment of child soldiers in conflict zones such as the DR Congo, Mali, Central African Republic, and Somalia. Religious enslavement occurs in scenarios where young girls are given to local priests to atone for their family sins, often resulting in forced prostitution. The practice of the Wahaya in northern Nigeria and Niger involves girls born into slavery being sold as a wife and subjected to domestic and sexual servitude. The persistence of these contemporary forms of slavery is deeply intertwined with the long-term legacies of historical slave trade. The economic, social, and political consequences, such as poverty, weak institutions, ethnic fragmentation, and a culture of distrust, create a fertile ground for modern forms of exploitation. The lack of economic opportunity itself, a legacy of historical underdevelopment, drives individuals into vulnerable situations where they are easily exploited. Further, the unresolved psychological and cultural scars of racism stemming from the historical racialization of slavery continue to manifest in contemporary social hierarchies and internalized racism within Africa, making certain groups more susceptible to exploitation. Current figures on modern slavery are conservative estimates due to significant data collections gaps and limitations, especially in conflict zones. So, in conclusion, slavery in Africa is a historical and contemporary reality of immense complexity and profound impact. This analysis has revealed that indigenous forms of servitude in pre-colonial Africa were diverse and not monolithic, often integrated into kinship structures and distinct from the absolute chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade that would later take over the continent of Africa. This pre-existing system, driven by social and economic needs, where human labor was a primary form of work, provided the foundation that external traders would later exploit. The continent became a central point for three major external slave trades. So these are the ones we have looked at: the trans-Saharan trade, the Indian Ocean, and the transatlantic slave trade. Each trade possesses unique characteristics, routes, and scales, collectively displacing millions of Africans over centuries. The trans-Saharan trade primarily moved individuals northward to the Arab world, while the Indian trade extended eastward, often allowing for some assimilation into Islamic societies. The transatlantic slave trade, driven by insatiable European demand for plantation labor in the Americas, was unprecedented in its scale, brutality, and dehumanizing of enslaved individuals as mere commodities. A critical observation is the significant African agency in this trade, as African leaders and merchants participated in the supply chain, albeit often under immense external pressure and in context of pre-existing internal conflict. The European naval technology and insatiable demand dramatically escalated the scale of brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, transforming it into industrial scale enterprise. So the profound impact of this slave trade on African societies are undeniable and enduring. We end today's episode here. So if you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like, share this video, and drop your comment as well. But before we go, don't forget, one day our lives will become history. What will posterity say about you? See you in the next episode.